Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to an author from New Jersey by Skype. It's S.L. Harby, and the book is Shadows of a Dream, and it'll keep you busy for a while. Hi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Gosh, this thing was epic. It was 500 and almost 600 pages.
It is pretty substantial.
Definitely. Tell me how the two worlds mirror each other.
Tyr is the reflection of Earth. It's based in a Dungeons and Dragons sort of medieval theme. Each person theoretically has a reflection in Tyr. They don't necessarily have the same personality or the same quirks, but they're very intricately tied together.
They were. It was almost as if two different stories were taking place throughout the whole book, and how they all tied in was really key.
Thank you. That was my intent, to tell two relatable stories and then just sort of bring them together so they came together at the end.
It was really insane. So why was there so much loss in the main characters' lives?
I just felt that a lot of us experience loss in our lives. Maybe, hopefully not to that extent, but it really was meant to be a little bit of a tragic story. So you can see the main character, Stephen, sort of, rise from the proverbial ashes of the tragedy that he's come across and the losses, to realize where he is supposed to be and the kind of man that he's always been, but he hasn't really come to that realization until he sees himself through someone else's eyes.
Definitely. So tell us a little bit about how Dungeons and Dragons works, because the game in this book is based off of that. And I'm sure readers that are really into Dungeons and Dragons and all the characters that can be incorporated into it and all the fantasy will really relate to the book. But for those who don't know a lot about Dungeons and Dragons, it sounds like you do. So can you give us a little background on what Dungeons and Dragons is?
Sure. Dungeons and Dragons, well, let me start with humans as a whole have always been centered around storytelling, right? Whether it was a wise person around a campfire telling stories that really sort of tie you to your history and to your culture, to authors, filmmakers, musicians. They're all trying to tell a story. And Dungeons and Dragons is the natural outgrowth of that. It's what's termed as a role-playing game, where you assume a role and then you navigate the world that's been put before you by the storyteller as that persona or that personality. It was designed, Dungeons and Dragons was the first of the role-playing games, and it was designed by a gentleman by the name of Gary Gygax. Originally released it and really started a whole genre of games, which out of which grew things like Vampire the Masquerade, which is a game that's based in a cyberpunk, but like a dark gothic sort of present where you play vampires, and if you like a specific geekdom, there's a role-playing game out there for you. Dungeons and Dragons happens to be one of my personal favorites. I've been playing since 1980, so for about 40 years, more than 40 years, it's been my sort of role-playing game of choice. Mm-hmm. So, it's really enjoyable. If someone is interested in that sort of thing, I would say give it a try. It's a golden age for Dungeons and Dragons now. Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast bought the licenses, and they've released the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which has a very low price of entry. So, give it a try. It's a lot of fun.
So what are some of the key mechanisms that you use in Dungeons and Dragons to create the story? Because the way that you wrote the story, it's these 4 guys that have been, was it 4? Yeah.
Yeah, it was 4 years.
So 4 guys that are involved in this game, and they meet like weekly to play this game. And some of the wives are like, just, do the lawn, So it sounds like the way that your story develops is that these guys have just developed the story. There's one person that is creating the story, and everybody's starting to play parts into it and act it. So how do all these little different dices and little figurines fit into how the game is played?
Okay, well, the core of Dungeons and Dragons and the core of role-playing games really is what gamers refer to as theater of the mind, right? The dice are important from a standpoint of you have to have some sort of a mechanism to decide whether you succeed or whether you fail. I mean, it's the natural outgrowth of Cowboys and Indians or whatever you played as a kid. We were like, oh, I shot you. No, you didn't. You missed. You have to have some way to determine which one is true. Did you get shot? Did you get missed? That's where the dice come in. And it's random, and there's a whole bunch of different dice, which sometimes is a little bit off-putting. The game started with D6s, which you could get out of Monopoly or craps or whatever. But then it's developed into specialty dice for specialty things. But in the end, you could do it with a coin, right? Like it's the determining success versus failure that matters, not necessarily the way in which you do that. In my opinion, everything else is just window dressing. The figures, the maps, the voices, this, that, and the other thing. It's all comes down to what you picture in your mind. The storyteller, or what they call the dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons, but it's really the storyteller who is designing the world and basically playing everyone that's not you. Will describe the scene or describe what's going on, and you picture it in your mind, and everyone around the table has a part in designing that story. It's the ultimate exercise in collaborative storytelling. So it's not necessarily the GM or the storyteller's story, because once a player puts their hands on it, it then becomes their story as well, and they mold the story, and then at the end you have a story that has been told by everyone around the table. The storyteller is just the one that has the most weight to move, because he's playing everything that's not the people around the table.
Yeah, I think for the people who don't know Dungeons and Dragons, this book really laid it out well as to how they look at it, how they find stories from people that might have passed on to incorporate and attach to and keep moving. So the person really never leaves their life.
That is true. That is true. And, it's also role-playing in general sometimes is a little bit off-putting to people, because there's no beginning and there's really no beginning and no real end, right? You start it, and I've known people that have been playing the same game of Dungeons and Dragons since the late 70s, and just, every week or every month, when you're younger, you get together multiple times. When I was in my teens, I was playing 4 times a week. Then into my 20s, that was down to about once a week. Now the group that I've been with for about 20 years now, we get together once a month. When wives and children and things like that, you know, your life sort of becomes more important and the game becomes less important. But you still love the camaraderie. You know, a lot of the older games come down to sitting around and discussing the games that you had in the past. You remember when we did that? You remember this adventure? But at its root, it's really no different than any other game that you would get together and play with your friends, fantasy football or Monopoly, except you get very invested in it and it's a very long-term process. Or it can be a 4-hour game, one and done. You know, it all depends on how the players want to run the game.
So the group you've been hanging out with for 20 years, how much of your experiences with them made it into the book?
A lot. Right now, my group is down to myself and 2 other people. At one point, I want to say I had 7. So people join and people leave. There's no one in the book that is taken whole from my experience, but the character of Ronnie is based on several people that I have come across, as are most of the characters are amalgams of situations that I've seen, people that I've played with, you know, in an attempt to make the characters relatable to not just people who don't have experience, but people who do have experience. You know, anyone that has played Dungeons and Dragons or another role-playing game can see either themselves or people they know in some of these characters. And to me, relatability is the most important thing about writing, because if a reader can't relate to your characters, it then just is, you know, it becomes reading an English novel, right? Like it becomes just tedious because you can't invest.
Definitely. Now, how long have you been writing?
I have been writing my entire life. This is the first book I've published, the first book I've been the first story that I've seen through from beginning to end, and I've been happy enough to publish. This is about 4 years worth of work. The sequel hopefully should be ready to be published by end of this year. So, you know, hopefully I can, you know, cut that 4 years down to a year. And, you know, I've learned a whole bunch of lessons that hopefully I can use moving forward. But I've always been a writer, and it comes from Dungeons and Dragons. It comes from, you know, I was a player and then I was a storyteller, and a natural outgrowth is writing those stories down that either you get to play with or you never get to play with. Because, oh, this is such a cool idea and we never got to do it. Let me just write it down. Maybe I can make something of it. And I want to say I have a dozen or so things that are sort of floating around on my hard drive that I started and I stopped, or I started and I looked at and was like, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's horrible. So it never got finished, but all of it leads up to the one thing that you get out and get published.
Okay. But the whole distortion on reality versus the fantasy world,
Mm-hmm.
Is it also a good coping coping thing for people that are going through different things?
Oh, it is. It is. I have had a couple of full disclosure. There are people that take it more seriously than it needs to be taken, right? Like, you know, and I can understand where they're coming from, because it is it can be used as the ultimate avoidance, right? Like, you really are not happy in your life or what's going on, so you hide in role playing. But just like you hide in video games or you hide in really any other activity. But I have also seen it used. I had a friend of mine who was struggling with some gender identities, and through role playing as a as a male character, she was able to sort of work through her gender issues to a point where she was comfortable with herself, right? And she had made some decisions to become happier and more herself.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that she would or would not have made those decisions without the game, but I do think it did help, right? It helped her in a no consequences environment to experiment and sort of come to grips. It definitely does help to set aside some of the stresses of your everyday life, and you have a really, really bad day at work, and you know that on Thursday night, right, you're going to game. That used to be my gaming night every Thursday. So for me, a 5-day week was really a 4-day week because I had gaming to look forward to on Thursday, and then Friday was the weekend. So it really did help me sort of deal with some longer, more stressful weeks. I do find that the week before we have a game is generally easier for me because you look forward to it and you have that time to get together with your friends and also to escape. And if you feel not so effective in life, you're going to be more effective in the game. And I think especially for younger people, it gives I don't want to say children, let's say youngsters, gives youngsters a chance to find their identities and also to be effective in a world that treats them like children, right? Like sometimes it's hard to be dealt with as a child, where in your mind, you're just a little adult. Like we all, when we were kids, didn't think of ourselves as kids. We thought ourselves as, I know better than my parents. I'm 8 years old. Right. I think the best way for me to describe that, Orson Scott Card wrote Ender's Game, and most of the characters were children, and he wrote them basically as little adults, and they were relatable to both children and adults because you could see yourself in them. So I think I went off topic a little bit, but yes, okay. I think it does help.
What is your background? What do you do for a living besides writing?
I'm an SQL programmer, so I program databases. I work for a software company that logs cancer. So not the most upbeat thing in the world, but and I went to school for history and education and then ended up in computers. So, it's a path.
Wow. But what impressed me most about the book was the current situation, that could be taking place in 2020 versus the fantasy realm and the game. I think it was one of the best books that just gives you a good picture of what Dungeons and Dragons is, what the escape is, and the limits of it. I thought you really did a good job with that. Was that your intent to make people understand?
Yes. I think it does make a good gateway. So like if you read the book and you're like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. And it's certainly the hobby that I love. It's so, anyone that gets into it, it's a victory for me. Because I do think it's a fun activity for those who enjoy it.
Definitely. But I think it gives the other perspective too for people who just don't understand it, because there's always so many myths and misconceptions with Dungeons and Dragons. But I think it gives, an honest look into what's going on in people's lives, how much the game, helps smooth these things out, and the dreams that, help incorporate where the story is going to turn to, what's coming up next, what's real, what's reality.
Absolutely.
And, understanding relationships.
Yes, it is a book about relationships, and, spoilers, there are some relationship issues as well. And unfortunately, some of those relationships don't turn out so well. But in life, there's not always a happy ending. Sometimes the happiest ending is just sort of to go your own way. But, I did my best to write the characters as relatable as possible, and real relatable characters have issues with relationships, whether it be friends, whether it be loved ones, whether it be enemies, right? Like it's all relationships.
Well, I think you did a fantastic job with it. So what did you learn from feedback from the people that have read the novel that you're going to be doing different in the next segment?
The journals I think were a little much. I enjoy them, and I think they serve the purpose that they were there for, but I think there'll be a little less in the next one. I actually in really early versions of the book, Aristoi was a man. And for those who haven't read the book, Aristoi is the main character's sort of comrade of necessity, who really develops into one of his remaining surviving friends, right? At this point, Aristoi may be his longest surviving friend. And I noted that the character itself was strong, although it didn't read the way I wanted it to read. And I really thought that the character read more as a female, even though it didn't change hardly anything about the character, except maybe in my own mind, right? The character is not necessarily, any different, any less effective, any less wise. Aristoi, bar none, is the breakout character of the book for my readers. I've had many people say, "This is great. I love Hollis. When are you going to write a book about Aristoi?" Because that's who I want. That's who I want to know about. And I found that I really do enjoy writing her. She's a fantastic, strong character that I just find fascinating. I have on my website some fiction, some prequel fiction, which you don't have to read to understand the book, and you don't have to read the book to understand the fiction. It's just there as sort of extra stories, and half of them are about Aristoi.
Oh, really? What about Samantha?
Samantha, I haven't written anything else about Samantha. Samantha is an interesting character, who, again, I don't want to engage in too much spoilers, but she is definitely has a storyline that I don't think you see coming, and definitely has a motivation that if you step back and look at it, you can see where she was coming from. I try to not write villains as sort of, mustache twirling people who tie women to railroad tracks, right? In my opinion, every villain is the hero of their own story. They have motivations for what they're doing. They may not be great motivations, and they may only be motivations for themselves, but in their mind, they are the hero of their story. So, and Samantha is really no different. Either is Plague Man, but Plague Man's a little harder to get behind.
That's great. Growing up, what was your favorite book of all time?
My favorite book of all time, that is really, really hard. I would say Ender's Game. If I had to pick one, Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Again, helped me through a lot because of his dealings with how he dealt with young people. And he made them into fully formed functional characters, as opposed to what you would consider to be children. But I read a whole bunch. I read, Fritz Lieber and, Howard, and even some Lovecraft, even though in modern day reading Lovecraft's not the most popular thing on the planet. And of course a whole lot of Tolkien. You can't be a fantasy writer or a gamer without having read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. But I would definitely say, pound for pound, Ender's Game is the book I've read the most, and I continue to read on a yearly basis just because I love the story so much. And it's very empowering.
Ooh, I don't know that one. I'm going to have to look into it.
It's a fantastic book. And then the sequel, Speaker of the Dead, is also fantastic, although it is a completely different book. I'm not a fan of anything he wrote after that, like in the series. It's just Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead, I think, are fantastic. After that, it starts to go a little downhill for me.
Well, I thought you did an outstanding job explaining the game.
Thank you.
And just the misconceptions. You had just a really good way about getting around it. You helped us get inside the gamer's head, understand what they were coming from, what they were dealing with, how they related, how the game added value to their lives, how it helped them step outside of themselves once they were out of that game and role-playing and deal with the real world. It was really outstanding. And
Thank you.
I think it would be good for anybody who questions how Dungeons and Dragons really works.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Seriously outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I hope people enjoy it.
Oh, I think they will. It's been amazing. And Stephen was a great character with a lot of flaws that were believable.
Again, relatability, I think, is super important in characters to keep the reader invested.
Yes, they will be invested. Thank you for sharing so much of how you came up with the story.
And thank you for having me.
Anytime. Until next time, keep asking questions. And if you've had questions about role-playing the game or Dungeons and Dragons, Shadows of a Dream will provide a lot of answers for you. And if you are one of those people that enjoys all of those things, you will get swept away in this series. We'll see you soon.